Roland Bennett stood on the Symphony Hall stage, hand gripping the microphone, spotlight washing over his face like truth demanding to be seen. Before him stretched rows of faces, hundreds of them, but his eyes found only one. The woman in row 12 sat frozen, her pale complexion now drained of all color. Roland smiled, not with malice but with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the next 60 seconds would reshape several lives forever. "Tonight, I'm about to reveal something that will change several lives in this room forever," his voice echoed through the sound system. Camera flashes erupted like small explosions of light. Nobody knew what was coming, least of all Constance Whitmore, trembling in her velvet seat 30 rows back. Before we dive into how this moment came to be, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they look, and subscribe because what happens next will remind you why standing up for dignity matters more than staying silent. Trust me, you'll want to see how this billionaire turned a moment of humiliation into a masterclass in grace and power. Now, let's rewind to 30 minutes earlier. 30 minutes before Roland's revelation, the Bennett family arrived at Symphony Hall precisely at 6:15 in the evening. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as Roland helped his daughter Jasmine out of their black sedan, her small hands clutching a leather violin case that cost more than most people's annual salary. Roland wore an Armani suit, midnight black with subtle pinstripes that caught the light when he moved. His wife Simone stepped onto the sidewalk in a navy cocktail dress that hugged her curves with elegant precision, her natural hair styled in an intricate updo that had taken 2 hours to perfect. Jasmine, 12 years old with bright eyes that sparkled with excitement, wore a pristine white dress that made her look like she belonged in a classical painting. The violin case she carried so carefully held a $250,000 instrument, an investment in her talent that her parents made without hesitation. They entered through the grand doors into a lobby that took Jasmine's breath away. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, adorned with a crystal chandelier that scattered rainbow prisms across marble floors. Gold leaf decorated the crown molding, and velvet ropes guided guests toward the main auditorium. Jasmine squeezed her father's hand, unable to contain her smile. "Daddy, it's so beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Roland squeezed back, his heart swelling with joy at seeing his daughter experience live orchestral music for the first time. "Wait until you hear them play, baby girl. It's going to change your life." Simone walked beside them, her hand resting on Jasmine's shoulder, equally excited to share this cultural milestone with their daughter. They approached the ticket verification desk where a young woman named Bethany sat checking credentials. She was perhaps 25, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing the standard black vest and white shirt of venue staff. When Roland presented their 3 VIP tickets for row A, seats 7 through 9, Bethany's professional smile faltered. Her eyes darted from the tickets to Roland's face, then to Simone, then to Jasmine. She picked up the tickets, examined them closely under her desk lamp, flipped them over as if searching for some hidden mark of fraud. "Just one moment," she said, her tone shifting from welcoming to suspicious in the span of 3 words. She picked up her desk phone and pressed a button. "Gregory, could you come to the front desk please? We have a situation." Roland felt the familiar tension creeping up his spine, that particular awareness that comes from a lifetime of navigating spaces where your presence is questioned. Simone's hand found his, squeezed gently. They had discussed this possibility on the drive over, hoped it wouldn't happen, but prepared themselves anyway. You learn to prepare. Gregory arrived within 90 seconds, a middle-aged man with graying temples and the bearing of someone who took his authority very seriously. He wore a navy blazer with the Symphony Hall crest embroidered on the breast pocket. Without greeting the Bennett family, he took the tickets from Bethany and studied them with furrowed brows. "Where did you acquire these tickets?" His question came out flat, accusatory rather than curious. Roland maintained his composure, his voice steady and professional. "We purchased them through your official website 3 weeks ago. Would you like to see the confirmation email?" Gregory's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, I would appreciate that." The emphasis on appreciate carried no gratitude whatsoever. While Simone retrieved her phone to pull up the email confirmation, Roland noticed other guests streaming past them. A white couple in their 60s, also holding VIP tickets, walked straight through without any verification beyond a quick glance. A group of 4 white patrons, laughing and chatting, presented their tickets and were waved through with warm smiles from the staff. Nobody asked them where they acquired their tickets. Nobody questioned their legitimacy. Nobody made them prove they belonged. Jasmine tugged on her mother's dress. "Mama, why are they only checking us?" Her voice carried confusion rather than accusation, the innocent observation of a child who hadn't yet learned to expect this treatment. Roland knelt down to his daughter's eye level, his large hands gently holding her small shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything will be fine. Sometimes people make mistakes, and we just have to be patient while they figure things out." He spoke loud enough for Gregory to hear, his words carrying layers of meaning that Jasmine was too young to fully grasp. Simone showed Gregory her phone screen with the official confirmation email, complete with order number, date of purchase, and the Symphony Hall logo at the top. Gregory read it twice, his jaw working as if chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. Finally, with visible reluctance, he handed the tickets back to Roland. "Everything appears to be in order. Enjoy the performance. No apology for the delay. No acknowledgement of the disrespect. Just a dismissal that felt more like a challenge than a welcome." As the Bennett family walked toward the auditorium entrance, Roland felt dozens of eyes on them. The encounter at the desk had drawn attention, and now they were marked. He straightened his shoulders, held his daughter's hand a little tighter, and walked with the dignity that nobody could take from him, no matter how hard they tried. The main auditorium took Jasmine's breath away all over again. Rows of plush red velvet seats descended toward a massive stage where music stands waited like soldiers at attention. The acoustics were legendary, the architecture designed to carry every note to every corner with crystalline clarity. Roland led his family down the center aisle toward row A, the coveted first row where the music would feel close enough to touch. Their seats, numbers 7, 8, and 9, offered a perfect view of the string section. Jasmine carefully placed her violin case beneath her seat, her eyes shining as she imagined herself on that stage someday. "Daddy, do you think I could play here one day?" Roland kissed the top of her head. "Baby girl, I know you will." They had barely settled into their seats when a presence loomed over them. Roland looked up to find a woman standing in the aisle, her expression hovering between disbelief and indignation. Constance Whitmore wore a crimson evening gown that probably cost $5,000, with a diamond necklace that caught the light and threw it back in aggressive sparkles. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup applied with professional precision. She looked like old money and carried herself like someone who had never been told no. Behind her stood a younger man, late 20s, wearing a gray suit and an expression of deep discomfort. This was Preston, her son, who looked like he already knew this would not end well. Constance's voice cut through the ambient chatter of gathering patrons. "Excuse me, I believe you're in the wrong seats." Her tone suggested this was not a question but a correction. Simone looked up with a polite smile, the kind practiced by black women who have learned to meet hostility with grace. "No, ma'am. These are our assigned seats. Row A, seat 7, 8, and 9. She gestured to the ticket stubs still in Roland's hand. Constance barely glanced at them. Her laugh came out sharp, like breaking glass. "That can't be right. Front row seats are reserved for patrons and donors. Not for." She paused, her eyes traveling from Roland's expensive suit to Simone's elegant dress to Jasmine's white outfit, taking inventory, making calculations, drawing conclusions based solely on the color of their skin. Roland stood slowly, unfolding his 6'5" frame until he towered over Constance. His voice remained calm, but something in it made people nearby stop their conversations. "We have our tickets right here, ma'am. We paid for these seats just like everyone else. He extended the tickets toward her. Constance didn't even look down. Her chin lifted higher, her nostrils flaring slightly. I don't care what tickets you have. You clearly don't belong here. These seats are for people who contribute to the arts, people of culture and refinement. The implication hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Preston touched his mother's elbow. Mom, maybe we should just find our seats and... Constance whirled on him with surprising speed. Be quiet, Preston. I'm handling this. She turned back to Roland and Simone, her voice rising in volume. I suggest you move to seats more appropriate for your background. Perhaps the balcony section would be more suitable. The word background dripped with contempt. Jasmine looked up at her mother, confusion morphing into hurt as she began to understand what was happening. Simone pulled her daughter close, feeling the child's body tense. We paid for these seats. We have every right to be here, Simone said, her voice shaking not with fear but with barely contained fury. Constance's face flushed red, her composure cracking. Don't you dare raise your voice at me. Do you know who I am? My family has supported this theater for 3 generations. 3 generations. We donated the chandelier in the lobby, the one you probably gawked at on your way in. She pointed back toward the entrance as if the chandelier itself would validate her superiority. This theater exists because of people like me, not people like you. The scene was drawing attention now. Patrons in nearby rows turned to watch, some whispering behind programs, others pretending not to notice while clearly listening to every word. A few looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Nobody intervened. This was the kind of moment where good people become complicit through silence, where the absence of action becomes its own form of endorsement. Roland felt all of it, the stares, the whispers, the performative obliviousness, but most of all he felt his daughter's small hand gripping his with desperate strength. Constance raised her arm and snapped her fingers, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a slap. Security. I need security here immediately. These people are in the wrong seats and refusing to move. 2 security guards appeared within seconds, both wearing dark uniforms, an expression of weary resignation, as if they had dealt with similar complaints before. Their name tags read Duke and Martinez. Duke, a white man in his 50s with tired eyes, approached first. Ma'am, what seems to be the problem? Constance pointed at the Bennett family as if they were trespassers in her home. These people are in VIP seats they clearly shouldn't have access to. I need them removed or relocated immediately. Duke looked at Roland with something that might have been sympathy or might have been exhaustion. Sir, may I see your tickets? Roland handed them over without argument, his jaw tight but his movements controlled. Duke examined the tickets carefully, then looked at the seat numbers, then back at the tickets. These tickets appear legitimate, ma'am, he said to Constance. They're valid for these exact seats. Constance's face contorted with frustration. I don't care if they appear legitimate. They must have bought them second-hand or used some kind of discount program. Check if the names match the tickets. Duke shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, these are general admission VIP tickets. They don't have specific names printed on them. Anyone who purchases them can use them. The explanation did nothing to calm Constance. If anything, it intensified her indignation. This is absolutely ridiculous. In my day, we knew how to maintain standards in places like this. Now anyone with money can just buy their way into decent society. She turned her gaze directly on Roland, her eyes cold and calculating. Let me guess, lottery winner. Or maybe you sold something you shouldn't have. Made some kind of deal that people like you make. The accusation was clear, the stereotype deployed like a weapon. Simone stood up, her entire body trembling with rage. How dare you? My husband is a respected businessman. We have as much right to be here as anyone in this building. Constance's laugh was cruel. Respected businessmen. Please. I know your type. Always playing the victim card, always claiming discrimination when you're simply not qualified to be in certain spaces. You want to be where you don't belong, and when people point it out, you cry racism. That's when Jasmine started crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears that streamed down her face as she tried to understand why this woman hated them for no reason she could comprehend. She whispered through her tears, "Daddy, I want to go home. Please, can we just go home?" Roland knelt beside his daughter, his heart breaking into pieces he would have to reassemble later. He wiped her tears with his thumb, his voice gentle despite the storm raging inside him. "No, baby. We're not going anywhere. We belong here just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Preston finally found his voice, stepping forward slightly. "Mom, this is enough. These people have done nothing wrong. Let's just find our seats and enjoy the concert." Constance rounded on her son with vicious precision. "You stay out of this, Preston. After everything I've done for you, after I pulled strings to get you that interview next week with one of the biggest tech companies in the country, the least you can do is support me when I'm trying to maintain standards." The mention of an interview made Roland's attention sharpen. He stood up, his eyes fixing on Preston with new interest. "Interview? What interview is that?" Preston looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "I have a job interview next week. With Bennett Technologies. It's for a senior management position." The name hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Simone's eyes went wide. She looked at her husband, saw the slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth, and had to bite her lip to keep from laughing at the cosmic irony unfolding before them. Constance, oblivious to the significance of what her son just revealed, pressed on with her tirade. "Yes, that's right. My son is about to start working for one of the most prestigious technology companies in America. He earned that opportunity through education and merit, through hard work and dedication. Unlike some people who get ahead through handouts and affirmative action, my son actually deserves his success." She looked directly at Roland when she said this, making sure her meaning was unmistakable. Roland nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Bennett Technologies. That's quite an interesting company." Constance waved her hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "Yes, some billionaire owns it. Very selective about who they hire. Very concerned with character and integrity." Preston had to submit a personal essay about his values, about who he is as a person. "They only want the best." Roland's smile widened just a fraction. "Values and character. Yes, those are very important in that company. Very important indeed." Something in his tone made Preston look at him more closely, made the young man's face drain of color as a terrible possibility began to dawn on him. But before he could say anything, the lights in the auditorium began to dim. A bell chimed 3 times, signaling that the performance would begin in 5 minutes. Constance straightened her dress with sharp, angry movements. "This conversation isn't over. I will be speaking to the theater management about this travesty." She grabbed Preston's arm and pulled him toward the back of the auditorium, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. They found seats in row 12, far from the stage, far from the Bennett family, but not nearly far enough from the consequences that were rapidly approaching. The auditorium lights dimmed to near darkness, leaving only the soft glow of emergency exit signs and the faint illumination from music stands on stage. Roland sat between his wife and daughter, both of whom were still trembling from the confrontation. Simone leaned over and whispered in his ear, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Should we tell them? Should we say something before this goes any further?" Roland shook his head slightly, his eyes focused on the empty stage ahead. "Not yet. Let's see how this plays out. Sometimes people need to understand the full weight of their actions." Jasmine wiped the last tears from her face, her small hand finding her father's larger one in the darkness. She squeezed tight, and he squeezed back, a silent promise that everything would be okay. The conductor emerged from the side stage, baton in hand, and the audience erupted in polite applause. The members of the orchestra were already in position, instruments ready. The conductor raised his baton, and the first notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony filled the space with such power that Jasmine gasped audibly. Despite everything that had just happened, the music penetrated her hurt and confusion, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. Her eyes widened as she watched the violinist's bows move in perfect synchronization, creating sounds she had only heard through recordings and her own practice sessions. For a moment, the ugliness of the past 20 minutes faded into the background. But 12 rows back, Constance Whitmore sat rigid in her seat, unable to enjoy the performance she had supposedly come to appreciate. Her hands gripped the armrests with white-knuckled intensity, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Preston sat beside her, his program held but unread, his mind racing through calculations and implications. He kept glancing at the back of Roland Bennett's head, visible even in the dim light due to his height and position in the front row. Preston's interview was in 4 days. 4 days. And his mother had just publicly humiliated a black family in front of hundreds of witnesses. The coincidence of the company name kept echoing in his mind, growing louder than the orchestra. Constance leaned over to Preston, whispering harshly enough that people in front of them turned around with annoyed expressions. "I can't believe they're just letting them sit there. This theater has really gone downhill. When your grandfather was on the board, they would never have allowed this kind of situation." Preston tried to shush her, but she continued, unable to contain her indignation. "We donate thousands every year, and this is how they treat us. Letting just anyone buy their way into VIP sections. It's disgraceful." Preston closed his eyes, wishing his mother would stop talking, wishing he had spoken up more forcefully, wishing he could rewind the last 30 minutes and make different choices. The first movement of the symphony concluded, and the audience applauded enthusiastically. Jasmine clapped hardest of all, her face glowing with joy that temporarily overshadowed her earlier hurt. Roland watched his daughter's expression and felt a fierce protective pride. This child, this talented, sensitive, brilliant child, deserved to experience beauty without having to fight for the right to witness it. The injustice of it burned in his chest like slow fire. As the second movement began, an usher quietly approached from the side aisle. He bent down and whispered something to Roland. Simone couldn't hear the exchange but saw her husband nod, then whisper something back. The usher nodded and slipped away as silently as he had come. Simone raised an eyebrow questioningly, but Roland just smiled and squeezed her hand. "Intermission should be interesting," he murmured so softly only she could hear. The orchestra played on, movement after movement, building toward the climactic finale. Jasmine sat on the edge of her seat, completely absorbed. Around them, other audience members seemed equally transfixed by the performance. But the beauty of the music couldn't completely erase the tension that still hummed beneath the surface. Several people who had witnessed the earlier confrontation kept glancing between the Bennett family and Constance Whitmore, sensing that something unresolved hung in the air like humidity before a storm. When the first half of the program concluded, the conductor bowed to thunderous applause. The lights came up slowly, and the audience began to stir, some heading for refreshments, others remaining in their seats to chat. But before people could fully mobilize, the theater's managing director walked onto the stage. Edward Morrison was a distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of refined bearing that came from decades in the arts administration. He carried a microphone and wore an expression of warm enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a few moments before intermission." His voice carried the practiced projection of someone comfortable with public speaking. The audience settled back into their seats, curious about this unexpected interruption of the usual routine. Edward smiled broadly, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "First, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for this very special charity concert. As you know, all proceeds from tonight's performance will benefit the Children's Music Education Fund, which provides instruments and lessons to young people who might not otherwise have access to musical training. Applause rippled through the audience. Edward let it die down before continuing. But tonight is special for another reason as well. 3 years ago, this historic theater faced a crisis. Our building was in desperate need of renovation. The roof leaked, the electrical systems were outdated, and we were in danger of having to close our doors permanently. Many of you remember those dark days. Heads nodded throughout the auditorium. The theater's financial troubles had been well publicized in the local arts community. We launched a capital campaign, hoping to raise the necessary funds. And then, something remarkable happened. An anonymous donor stepped forward and contributed $20 million. Gasps echoed through the space. Even people who had heard rumors of this donation reacted with amazement at having the amount confirmed. $20 million, Edward repeated, letting the number sink in. This extraordinary generosity saved our theater. It paid for a new roof, updated electrical and plumbing systems, restored our historic facade, renovated our restrooms and concession areas, and upgraded our acoustics and lighting systems. Everything you've experienced tonight, from the moment you walked in and saw our restored lobby chandelier to the crystal clear sound you just enjoyed, exists because of one person's vision and generosity. The audience hung on every word. Constance Whitmore sat very still, her earlier agitation replaced by smug satisfaction. She whispered to Preston, "I wonder who it is. Probably someone we know from the club. Very generous of them." Preston didn't respond. His attention was locked on Edward Morrison's next words with the intensity of someone watching their life flash before their eyes. Edward continued, building drama like the skilled presenter he was. This individual wished to remain anonymous. He didn't want recognition or publicity. He simply wanted to ensure that this temple of art and culture would continue to serve our community for generations to come. But tonight, after much discussion, he has agreed to step forward and allow us to publicly thank him. Edward paused, his eyes moving deliberately to the front row. This gentleman is here with his beautiful family. He came tonight not as a donor seeking acknowledgement, but simply as a father wanting to share the magic of live music with his daughter. Roland felt Simone's hand tighten around his. Jasmine looked up at her father, confusion in her eyes. Edward's voice swelled with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor and privilege to introduce you to Mr. Roland Bennett, the founder and chief executive officer of Bennett Technologies, the philanthropist who saved Symphony Hall, and the man without whom none of us would be sitting here tonight. The silence that followed Edward's announcement lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but those seconds stretched like taffy, thick and endless. Then the auditorium exploded with applause. People leaped to their feet, some gasping audibly, others exchanging looks of shock and delight. Roland stood slowly, helping Simone to her feet, then lifting Jasmine onto his hip despite her protests that she was too old to be carried. The three of them walked toward the stage steps, and the applause grew even louder. Camera phones appeared like fireflies, flashes popping from every direction as people documented this unexpected moment. 12 rows back, Constance Whitmore sat frozen. Her face had gone from red to white so quickly it seemed she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, no sound emerging. Her hands gripped the armrests so hard her knuckles looked like they might split through the skin. Preston sat beside her, his head in his hands, making a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The full magnitude of what his mother had done was crashing down on him with the force of a collapsing building. Roland climbed the stage steps with his family, and Edward Morrison rushed forward to shake his hand enthusiastically. The applause continued for nearly a full minute before Edward raised his hands to quiet the crowd. "Thank you, thank you. Please, let's give Mr. Bennett a chance to speak." The audience settled into expectant silence, every eye fixed on the tall black man now standing center stage, looking remarkably composed for someone who had been publicly humiliated less than an hour earlier. Roland accepted the microphone from Edward and took a moment to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the auditorium that his money had restored. "Thank you, Edward. And thank you all for that warm welcome. I'll admit, I wasn't planning to make any speeches tonight. My wife and I brought our daughter here because she's a violinist, a very talented one I might add, and we wanted her to experience the magic of a live orchestra for the first time." He looked down at Jasmine, still in his arms, and smiled. "Baby, are you enjoying it?" Jasmine nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The audience awed collectively. Roland set Jasmine down gently, keeping one hand on her shoulder. "I grew up on the south side of Chicago. My mother worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in the suburbs. She would take 2 buses each way, leaving before dawn and getting home after dark, just to earn enough to keep a roof over our heads and food on our table. We didn't have much, and we certainly didn't have exposure to things like symphony orchestras or art museums or any of the cultural institutions that define a well-rounded education." His voice carried no self-pity, just straightforward honesty. "But my mother was determined that I would have opportunities she never had. When I was 8 years old, she saved for 6 months to buy me a used keyboard from a pawn shop. $50, which might as well have been $1,000 for us back then. That keyboard changed my life. It opened a door to a world I didn't know existed, a world where beauty and structure and emotion all came together in mathematical precision." The audience listened in absolute silence, captivated. "Music taught me discipline. It taught me that practice and persistence could transform noise into harmony. It taught me to hear patterns and possibilities. Those lessons carried me through school, through college, through building my first company in a garage with 3 maxed-out credit cards and a prayer. And when that company succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, I never forgot where I came from or what gave me the foundation to get where I am." Roland paused, letting his words resonate. "So when I learned that Symphony Hall was in danger of closing, that children like my younger self might lose access to this incredible space, I knew I had to act. $20 million is a lot of money, yes. But it's nothing compared to the value of preserving a place where beauty lives, where children can discover that the world holds more than just struggle and survival." The applause began again, but Roland held up his hand gently. "Please, hold on. I'm not finished." The crowd quieted immediately, sensing a shift in his tone. "Now, before I continue with what happened next, I need to pause and ask you something. If you believe that every person deserves to be treated with basic human dignity regardless of their race or background, type number 1 in the comments right now. And if you think what happened to this family before the concert was wrong, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because what I'm about to reveal next will show you exactly why standing up to discrimination matters more than staying comfortable. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done if you were sitting nearby when this family was being harassed. Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? Let me know, because silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of participation. Now, let's see what Roland says next that makes the entire audience gasp. Roland's expression shifted from warm reminiscence to something harder, more deliberate. His eyes swept across the auditorium, pausing briefly on row 12 before addressing the crowd once more. "However, tonight reminded me that writing a check isn't enough. Funding renovation projects isn't enough. We can restore buildings to their former glory, but if we don't address what happens inside those buildings, we've accomplished nothing of lasting value." His voice carried an edge now, sharp enough that people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 30 minutes before this performance began, my family was told we didn't belong in our seats. Not because there was a problem with our tickets, though those were questioned extensively. Not because we were being disruptive, though we were certainly scrutinized far more than other patrons entering at the same time. We were told we didn't belong because of how we look. The auditorium went very still. You could hear the ventilation system humming, that's how quiet it became. Simone stepped closer to Roland, her hand finding his. Jasmine stared at her shoes, reliving the humiliation. Roland continued, his voice gaining strength. We were confronted by another patron who demanded that security remove us from the front row. She stated that these seats were reserved for people of culture and refinement, for people who contribute to the arts. She suggested we move to the balcony, to somewhere more appropriate for our background. He let those words hang in the air like indictments. She called security. She made a scene. She reduced my 12-year-old daughter to tears because she was convinced that black people couldn't possibly belong in the front row of a theater, especially not a theater her family had supported for generations. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Some people looked around, trying to identify who would do such a thing. Others stared straight ahead, perhaps uncomfortable with confronting this reality so directly. Roland's voice softened, but the power behind it didn't diminish. This person didn't know that I wrote the check that saved this building. She didn't know that my company employs over 15,000 people. She didn't know anything about me or my family except what she could see with her eyes, and that was enough for her to judge us as unworthy. He paused, his throat working as he swallowed emotion. But here's the thing. It shouldn't matter who I am or what I've accomplished. My family deserved basic respect and dignity regardless of my bank account or my business success. Every person who walks through these doors deserves that. The applause started slowly, then built like a wave reaching shore. People stood again, this time not in celebratory excitement but in solidarity and support. Some were wiping tears. Others looked angry, their faces flushed with secondhand outrage. Roland waited for the applause to subside before he delivered his final observation. The person who confronted us bragged about her family's 3 generations of support for this theater. She mentioned that they donated the chandelier in the lobby. Roland's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. That chandelier, beautiful as it is, was damaged during our renovation. The repairs cost $45,000. I paid for those repairs. So in a very real sense, her family's legacy donation only continues to exist because of my contribution. I find that irony almost poetic. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the audience. But this isn't about money. This isn't about who donated more or who has the right to claim ownership of public spaces. This is about the fact that my daughter asked me if we could go home. She wanted to leave because a stranger made her feel unwelcome in a place that should welcome everyone. Roland looked down at Jasmine, his eyes glistening. I told her no. I told her we belong here because we do. We belong everywhere that celebrates beauty and culture and human achievement. And nobody, regardless of how much money their family has given or how many generations they've been members of this community, has the right to make anyone feel otherwise. The standing ovation that followed lasted 3 full minutes. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering, some whistling, others calling out support. Edward Morrison stood to the side, tears streaming down his face, nodding vigorously. This was not how he had planned for this evening to unfold, but he recognized the importance of this moment, the necessity of letting Roland speak his truth. Roland waited for the applause to fade before continuing, his expression shifting from emotional reflection to something more calculated, more purposeful. The audience sensed the change and settled into attentive silence once more, understanding that another shoe was about to drop. There's something else that happened during that confrontation that I think bears examination, Roland said, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone building to a point. The person who confronted my family mentioned her son. She mentioned that he has a job interview scheduled for next week with a major technology company. Preston Whitmore, still seated in row 12, made a small sound of distress. Constance grabbed his wrist, her fingernails digging in hard enough to leave marks, though whether she was trying to comfort him or restrain herself was unclear. People near them had already put the pieces together and were staring openly now, no longer pretending not to notice. Roland continued, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding in the back rows, though his awareness was actually razor-sharp. She was very proud of this interview. She mentioned that the company is very selective, that they care deeply about character and integrity. She explained that her son had to submit a personal essay about his values as part of the application process. Roland paused, his eyes finding Preston in the crowd with laser precision. Preston Whitmore. That's your name, correct? Preston stood slowly, his legs shaking visibly even from a distance. His voice cracked when he answered. Yes, sir. That's me. Every head in the auditorium swiveled toward him. If Preston had any hope of anonymity, it evaporated in that moment. He stood exposed under the weight of collective attention, his mother's hand still gripping his wrist. Roland nodded slowly. Your interview is scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. The position is Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships. Your resume shows an MBA from Wharton, 10 years of progressive experience in business development, and recommendations from 3 Fortune 500 executives. On paper, you're an excellent candidate. The qualification in his voice was unmistakable. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. At Bennett Technologies, we pride ourselves on being thorough in our hiring process. We don't just look at degrees and experience. We dig deeper. We want to know who our employees are when nobody's watching, how they treat people who can't benefit them, what they stand for when standing up might cost them something. Roland's voice carried the authority of someone who had built an empire on these principles. Every senior-level candidate submits an essay about their core values. You wrote very eloquently about integrity, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, about the importance of creating inclusive environments where everyone can thrive. Preston's face had gone gray. He looked like he might be sick right there in the middle of Symphony Hall's elegant auditorium. Constance still gripped his wrist, but her own face had gone slack with dawning horror. Roland let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable before continuing. Here's what I need to know, Preston. When you wrote that essay about standing up for what's right, did you mean it? Because tonight, when your mother confronted my family, when she called us unworthy and demanded we be removed from our seats, you had an opportunity to live those values you wrote about so convincingly. Roland's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but somehow became more penetrating. You told her to stop. I heard that. You tried to intervene, somewhat. But did you do enough? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by thread. Preston opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. No, sir. I didn't do enough. I should have. I could have. His voice broke. There's no excuse. What my mother did was wrong, and I should have stopped her more forcefully. I should have defended your family. I should have stood between you and her words. I didn't, and I'm ashamed of that failure. Constance finally found her voice, strangled as it was. This is absurd. You can't punish my son for my words. He had nothing to do with what I said. Her protest came out shrill, desperate, the sound of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. Roland turned his attention to her fully for the first time since taking the stage. The look he gave her could have frozen water. Mrs. Whitmore, you're absolutely right that your son isn't responsible for your words. But he is responsible for his actions and his inactions. Just as you are responsible for teaching him, through your example tonight, that this kind of behavior is acceptable. Roland's words came out measured, deliberate. You made assumptions about my family based solely on our skin color. You tried to humiliate us. You wanted us removed from seats that I, quite literally, paid to have installed. And you did all of this while your son watched, while he prepared for an interview with my company, a company that exists because I built it from nothing despite facing people like you at every turn. Constance opened her mouth to respond, but Roland held up a hand. I don't need to hear explanations or justifications. I'm sure you have many. People always do. But here's what I hope you understand, you didn't just insult 3 strangers tonight. You showed my daughter that no matter how talented she is, no matter how hard she works, no matter what her father achieves, there will always be people who see her as less than, as someone who doesn't belong. His voice finally betrayed emotion, a tremor of pain that made several audience members gasp. You looked at a 12-year-old child and decided she was unworthy. That's what I cannot forgive. Simone stepped forward, taking the microphone from her husband's hand. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of every black mother who has had to comfort her child after facing discrimination. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll never know what it's like to have to explain to your daughter why someone hates her for no reason. You'll never know the feeling of watching your child's joy turn to confusion and then to hurt because of someone else's prejudice. But I truly hope, that you take this moment and learn from it. I hope you become better. Roland took the microphone back, his expression softening slightly. Preston, your interview is still scheduled for Tuesday morning. A collective exhale swept through the audience, followed immediately by confused murmurs. Preston looked up, shock evident on his face. Sir. His voice was barely audible. But it won't be a standard interview, Roland continued. Instead, you're going to spend the day with our diversity, equity, and inclusion team. You're going to meet with employees who have faced discrimination in corporate settings. You're going to participate in our racial bias training that we require of all new hires. You're going to listen to stories from people who look like me, like my wife, like my daughter, and you're going to learn what we face every single day. Preston nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. I'll be there. I'll do whatever you ask. Roland held up a hand. I'm not finished. After that day, if you still want the job, and if our DEI team believes you've genuinely engaged with the material and demonstrated capacity for growth, then we'll schedule a formal interview. But understand this clearly, at Bennett Technologies, we have zero tolerance for racism, discrimination, or prejudice of any kind. Not from customers, not from partners, and absolutely not from employees. If you join our team, you'll be held to that standard every single day. Preston's voice came out stronger now, infused with something that might have been hope or might have been desperate determination. Mr. Bennett, I want to apologize publicly. What my mother did tonight was unconscionable. What I failed to do was unacceptable. I should have defended your family more forcefully. I should have stood between you and her prejudice. I didn't, and that failure is mine to own. He took a shaky breath. I can't undo what happened tonight, but I can promise you that I will learn from it. I will do better. I will be better. Roland studied Preston for a long moment, the kind of evaluative silence that feels eternal when you're on the receiving end of it. Finally, he nodded once. Apologies are important. But actions matter more than words. Show me through your behavior, through your choices, through how you treat people when it costs you something, that this moment changed you. That's all I ask. He turned his attention back to Constance, who sat hunched in her seat, trying to make herself small despite her expensive dress and jewelry that caught every light. Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you reflect deeply on what happened tonight. I hope you think about my daughter's tears. I hope you examine the assumptions you made and the harm you caused. And I hope you understand that privilege, whether it comes from money or race or family legacy, doesn't give you the right to diminish other human beings. Roland's voice carried no anger now, only a kind of weary sadness. We could be allies in making this world more equitable. Instead, you chose to be an obstacle. That choice was yours, and the consequences are yours to bear. The auditorium remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Edward Morrison stepped forward, clearing his throat. Mr. Bennett, on behalf of Symphony Hall and everyone here tonight, I want to offer our sincerest apologies for what you and your family experienced. This is absolutely unacceptable, and we will be implementing immediate changes to ensure it never happens again. Roland nodded his thanks, then turned back to the audience one final time, ready to conclude his unexpected address and transform this painful moment into something that might actually create change. Roland's posture shifted slightly, the emotional weight of confronting his family's treatment giving way to the strategic mindset of a man who built billion-dollar companies by seeing problems as opportunities for systemic change. Thank you, Edward. But investigations and apologies, while important, won't fundamentally change anything unless we commit to concrete action. He looked out over the audience, his gaze sweeping across hundreds of faces, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable, all attentive. Tonight made me realize that writing a check to restore a building isn't enough. We need to restore humanity in these spaces too. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing an announcement. Roland continued, his voice taking on the decisive tone of someone making commitments he would absolutely keep. I'm announcing tonight the creation of the Dignity in Arts Initiative. My foundation will contribute $5 million annually to ensure that arts organizations across the country implement mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all staff, volunteers, and board members. Applause erupted, but Roland spoke over it. This isn't optional training that people can ignore or treat as a checkbox exercise. Organizations that accept this funding will be held accountable for measurable changes in their practices and the experiences of their patrons. Edward Morrison's eyes went wide with surprise and gratitude. He began applauding enthusiastically, and the rest of the audience joined him in a standing ovation. Roland waited for the noise to subside before continuing. Additionally, the Bennett Foundation will establish the Young Musicians of Promise Scholarship Program, providing full-ride scholarships, instruments, private lessons, and mentorship to talented young people of color who want to pursue music seriously. My daughter shouldn't be an exception. She should be one of many black and brown children who see themselves reflected in orchestras, operas, and concert halls across this nation. Jasmine looked up at her father with wide eyes, understanding for the first time that something good might come from the pain she had experienced tonight. Simone wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders, tears streaming freely down her face now. Roland glanced at them, drew strength from them, and pressed forward. But individual initiatives, while valuable, won't solve the deeper problem. The deeper problem is that we live in a society where assumptions based on race remain acceptable, where a black family can have their right to occupy space questioned, where my daughter can be made to feel like an intruder in a building her father's money restored. His voice grew stronger, more insistent. So here's what else I'm committing to. Bennett Technologies will be launching a corporate accountability in arts partnerships program. Any arts organization that wants sponsorship or partnership with my company will need to demonstrate concrete policies and practices that ensure equitable access and treatment for all patrons. The implications of this rippled through the audience. Bennett Technologies was known as a major corporate sponsor of cultural institutions nationwide. This policy would have far-reaching effects. Roland saw the realization dawn on faces throughout the auditorium and nodded. Yes, this will require real change from organizations that want our support. That's the point. Money talks. Let's make sure it's saying the right things. He turned to Edward Morrison directly. Edward, Symphony Hall was already on the right path. You've welcomed my family here, and you're committed to making changes. I trust you to lead by example. I'm pledging an additional $3 million specifically for Symphony Hall to create a community access and inclusion program. Free concerts for underserved communities. Transportation provided for students from low-income areas. Instrument lending libraries. Whatever it takes to make sure the next generation of musicians has access regardless of their zip code or economic status. Edward's hands shook as he accepted the microphone. Mr. Bennett, your generosity is. I don't have words. But more than your financial support, your moral leadership tonight has given us all something to aspire to. Symphony Hall commits to being a model of inclusivity and equity. We will prove worthy of your trust. The two men shook hands, and the audience applauded again, though the mood had shifted from celebratory to something more solemn, more aware of the responsibility being placed on everyone present. Roland raised his hand for quiet. There's one more thing I need to address. His eyes found Preston in row 12 again. Preston, when you come to our offices on Tuesday, you won't be the only one there for a learning experience. I'm requiring all of our senior leadership to participate in renewed anti-racism training. What happened tonight reminded me that we can never become complacent. This work is ongoing, and it starts at the top. If I expect our employees to uphold certain standards, I need to demonstrate my commitment to continuous learning too. This admission of his own need for ongoing education seemed to release something in the room. Several people nodded, some looking relieved that even the man who had been victimized acknowledged that combating racism requires constant vigilance and self-examination. Preston stood again, his voice clearer than before. Mr. Bennett, I'll be there Tuesday morning, and I'll approach it with the seriousness it deserves. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to learn and grow. I won't waste it. Roland acknowledged him with a nod, then turned his attention one final time to Constance Whitmore, who had been sitting frozen in her seat like a statue of shame. Mrs. Whitmore, I said earlier that I can't forgive what you did to my daughter. That was true in the heat of the moment. But I'm reconsidering that position now. Constance's head snapped up, hope flickering across her face for the first time since her world collapsed. I can't forgive it easily, and I won't forget it, Roland clarified. But I believe in the possibility of change. If you're willing to do the hard work of examining your biases, of understanding the systems of oppression that your attitudes support, of becoming actively anti-racist rather than simply denying racism, then I believe redemption is possible. He paused, letting that conditional offer hang in the air. But that work is yours to do. Nobody can do it for you. Preston attending training is a start for him, but it doesn't absolve you of your own responsibility to grow. Constance stood on shaking legs. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of all the earlier arrogance, reduced to something raw and almost childlike. Mr. Bennett, I don't know what to say except that I was wrong. Profoundly, inexcusably wrong. I let my prejudices and my sense of entitlement override basic human decency. I hurt your daughter, and I hurt you and your wife, and I did it publicly and deliberately. She was crying now, makeup running in dark streaks down her face. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I will do the work. I will examine myself. I will change. Not because I'm afraid of social consequences, but because I'm horrified by who I revealed myself to be tonight. The confession seemed genuine, raw enough to be real. Roland studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then start by apologizing to my daughter. She's the one you hurt most deeply. Every eye in the auditorium turned to Constance, waiting. She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands, and looked at Jasmine, who stood beside her mother on stage, small and vulnerable and remarkably composed for a 12-year-old who had been through so much. Jasmine, Constance's voice cracked on the name. I am so deeply sorry for how I treated you and your family tonight. What I did was cruel and racist and unforgivable. You are a talented, beautiful young person who deserves to be celebrated and welcomed everywhere you go. I hope you never let people like me make you doubt your worth. You belong here. You belong everywhere. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The apology came out between sobs, unpolished but seemingly heartfelt. Jasmine looked up at her father, seeking guidance. Roland squeezed her shoulder gently, giving permission but not instruction. Jasmine took a deep breath, stepped forward to the edge of the stage, and spoke with a clarity that belied her age. Thank you for apologizing. I hope you really do change. I hope you never make another kid feel the way you made me feel tonight. Because it hurt. It hurt so much. Her voice wavered but didn't break. But I'm not going to let it make me small. My daddy taught me that I belong, and I'm going to believe that even when people like you try to tell me I don't. The auditorium erupted in applause so loud it felt physical. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering, whistling, shouting support. Jasmine, overwhelmed, turned and buried her face in her mother's side. Simone held her daughter tight, whispering things the microphones couldn't catch. Roland stood to the side, his eyes glistening with tears he no longer tried to hide. His daughter, his brave, brilliant daughter, had just given a master class in dignity to every adult in the room. Edward Morrison stepped forward, understanding that this moment needed to transition back to the scheduled program before the emotional intensity became too much to bear. I think we can all agree that Jasmine Bennett has a bright future ahead of her, not just as a musician but as a voice for justice and equality. I know I speak for everyone when I say we look forward to seeing what she accomplishes. More applause. Now, let's take our 15-minute intermission. When we return, the orchestra will perform Dvorak's New World Symphony, which feels particularly appropriate tonight. This is a work about finding home in unfamiliar places, about belonging despite difference. I encourage you all to reflect during the break on what you've witnessed tonight and what role each of you can play in creating a world where moments like this are no longer necessary. The lights came up fully, and the spell broke. People began standing, stretching, talking in animated voices. Many headed toward the stage, wanting to speak to Roland and his family. Edward quickly organized volunteers to form a respectful barrier, giving the Bennett space while accepting well wishes on their behalf. Preston Whitmore moved against the crowd, trying to reach the stage. Constance followed behind him, moving slowly, as if she had aged a decade in the last hour. The 15-minute intermission stretched to 20 as people crowded the lobby and hallways, everyone wanting to discuss what had just transpired. Roland, Simone, and Jasmine were escorted to a private room backstage, given space to decompress away from the well-meaning but overwhelming attention. Jasmine collapsed into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "Daddy, was what I said okay? Did I do good?" Her voice was small again, the brief courage of the stage fading into normal childhood need for reassurance. Roland knelt in front of his daughter, taking both her hands in his much larger ones. "Baby girl, you were perfect. You were brave and strong and so incredibly articulate. I'm more proud of you than I can possibly express." He kissed her forehead. "But you know what? You didn't have to be perfect. You didn't have to say anything at all. Just standing up there with us was enough. Don't ever feel like you have to perform strength when you're hurting." Jasmine nodded, then launched herself into her father's arms, finally letting out the tears she had been holding back. Roland held her, rocking slightly, while Simone rubbed circles on her daughter's back. A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. Edward Morrison poked his head in apologetically. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, but Preston Whitmore and his mother are asking if they might speak with you briefly." "I can absolutely send them away if you'd prefer." Roland looked at Simone, who shrugged, leaving the decision to him. He looked down at Jasmine. "What do you think, sweetheart? Do you want to talk to them, or should we tell them no?" The fact that he gave his 12-year-old daughter veto power over this decision said everything about his parenting philosophy. Jasmine wiped her eyes. "We can talk to them. But just for a little bit. I'm really tired." Roland nodded and told Edward to send them in. Preston entered first, followed by Constance. Both looked diminished somehow, as if the revelation of their misjudgment had physically shrunk them. Preston stood with his hands clasped in front of him like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. Constance couldn't seem to meet anyone's eyes directly. Preston spoke first, his voice steady despite his obvious nerves. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, Jasmine. I wanted to thank you for agreeing to see us. You didn't have to." He took a breath. "I've been thinking about what you said up there, about actions mattering more than words. You're absolutely right. So I want to tell you what actions I'm going to take." He pulled out his phone and showed them a screen. "I've already registered for a 6-week anti-racism course at the community center. It starts next week. I've also reached out to 3 organizations that fight racial injustice to volunteer my business development skills." Roland raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. "You did all that during intermission?" Preston nodded. "Yes, sir. I spent the first 5 minutes of intermission in the bathroom trying not to throw up, and then I spent the rest making these arrangements. I figure if I'm serious about change, I need to start immediately, not wait until it's convenient. The honesty was disarming. Roland felt some of his anger begin to thaw, just slightly. Constance stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Bennett, may I speak?" Roland gestured for her to continue. She twisted her hands together, the massive diamond ring on her finger catching the light. "I've also been making arrangements. I've contacted a therapist who specializes in racial bias and prejudice. I have an appointment on Monday. I'm also resigning from the Symphony Hall board effective immediately." This surprised everyone, including Preston, who looked at his mother in shock. "I thought about what you said, about privilege not giving me the right to diminish others, and I realized that I've been using my position on that board to maintain exactly the kind of exclusionary practices that hurt people. I've voted against discount ticket programs because I worried about the wrong element attending performances. I've opposed outreach to urban schools because I thought it would lower the cultural standards of our audience." She was crying again, but pushed through it. "I'm ashamed of those positions now. I can't undo those votes, but I can remove myself from making any more harmful decisions while I work on becoming someone better." Simone, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Mrs. Whitmore, resignation is one thing. Actively working to reverse the damage is another. Will you advocate for the programs you previously opposed?" Constance looked startled by the direct question, then nodded vigorously. "Yes. Yes, I will. I'll write letters to the board. I'll donate specifically to community outreach programs. I'll do whatever I can to push back against the mentality I used to embody." Simone studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement of intent. Roland stood up, still holding Jasmine's hand. "I appreciate both of you coming here. I appreciate the steps you're taking. But I need you to understand something crucial." He paused, making sure he had their full attention. "What you're doing now shouldn't be about avoiding consequences or rehabilitating your reputations. It needs to be about genuinely transforming your understanding of the world and your place in it. If you're doing this to make yourselves feel better or to smooth over social awkwardness, it won't last. Real anti-racist work is uncomfortable and ongoing and never finished." Preston nodded seriously. "I understand, sir. And I want you to know that I've already told my mother that regardless of what happens with my potential job, I'm committing to this work. Even if you decide not to interview me at all, even if I never work for Bennett Technologies, I'm going to continue learning and growing and using whatever privilege I have to fight against the systems that enabled my mother's behavior tonight." The conviction in his voice seemed genuine. Jasmine, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Preston." He immediately dropped to one knee so he was at her eye level, an unconscious gesture of respect that Roland noted approvingly. "Yes, Jasmine." She looked at him with those serious 12-year-old eyes that seemed much older after the evening's events. "Do you have any kids?" Preston shook his head. "No, not yet." Jasmine nodded. "When you do, are you going to teach them to be like your mom was, or like you're trying to be now?" The question hung in the air like a test. Preston's eyes welled up, and his voice came out rough. "Like I'm trying to be now. I promise you, Jasmine, if I'm blessed with children someday, I will raise them to see everyone as equal, to stand up against injustice, to never make anyone feel the way my mother made you feel. That's a promise I'm making to you right now." Jasmine considered this, then stuck out her hand. Preston shook it gently, sealing a promise that felt sacred despite the informal setting. Constance watched this exchange, more tears flowing. "Jasmine, may I say something to you?" Jasmine nodded, still holding her father's hand. Constance knelt down too, ruining her expensive dress on the dusty backstage floor. "Sweetheart, I need you to know that what I did tonight had nothing to do with you. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't deserve any of it. The ugliness that came out of me came from inside me, from beliefs I was taught and never questioned, from a sense of superiority I had no right to feel. I want you to forget everything I said about you not belonging, because it was a lie. You belong everywhere. Do you understand? Jasmine nodded slowly. I think so. My dad says that when people are mean, it's usually because they're hurting inside, not because of anything you did. Constance let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. Your father is a wise man. Much wiser than me. But I'm going to try to be wiser now. I'm going to try to be someone you could respect, even though I know I don't deserve your respect after tonight. Jasmine thought about this seriously. My teacher says everyone deserves a second chance if they really mean it. Do you really mean it? The question, asked with such childlike directness, seemed to cut through everything. Constance nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she found her voice, it was barely a whisper. Yes, sweetheart. I really mean it. I'm going to spend the rest of my life meaning it. Jasmine nodded, satisfied with this answer. Okay then. I hope you do good. The simple forgiveness of a child who still believed in redemption brought fresh tears to Constance's eyes. Edward Morrison knocked again, apologetically. I'm so sorry, but we need to start the second half soon. The orchestra is ready. Roland nodded, understanding. He looked at Preston and Constance. We need to return to our seats. Thank you for speaking with us. I meant what I said earlier. Redemption is possible, but it requires genuine work. I'll be paying attention to see if your actions match your words tonight. Preston stood, helping his mother to her feet. We understand, Mr. Bennett. Thank you for giving us this chance. We won't waste it. As Preston and Constance left the room, Simone turned to her husband. Do you believe them? Do you think they'll actually follow through? Roland considered the question carefully. I think Preston will. He seems genuinely shaken, genuinely committed to change. His mother. He paused. I think she's horrified by her own behavior, which is a start. Whether that horror translates into lasting change remains to be seen. But I'd rather give them the opportunity to prove themselves than assume the worst. Simone nodded, leaning against her husband. When did we become the people who have to decide whether to grant forgiveness for racism? I'm so tired of this being our burden to bear. Roland wrapped his arms around his wife. I know, baby. I know. But if we don't create space for people to change, who will? And if we don't hold them accountable for actually changing, they'll take the easy path of performative allyship without substance. We're doing this for Jasmine, for every child who comes after her. We're trying to make the world slightly less exhausting for them. Simone nodded against his chest, drawing strength from him as she had for 20 years of marriage. Jasmine tugged on both their hands. Can we go watch the rest of the concert now? I want to hear the music again. Her parents looked down at their remarkable daughter and smiled. Despite everything, despite the pain and humiliation, she still wanted to experience the beauty she came for. That resilience, that refusal to let cruelty destroy joy, was perhaps the most powerful form of resistance possible. Roland squeezed her hand. Yes, baby girl. Let's go hear some beautiful music. The Bennett family returned to their seats in row A to a standing ovation that caught them completely off guard. As they walked down the center aisle, people rose to their feet, applauding not just Roland's revelations but their grace, their courage, their willingness to transform a moment of pain into an opportunity for education and change. Jasmine held tight to both her parents' hands, overwhelmed by the attention but also visibly moved by the support. An elderly black woman in row 5 reached out as they passed, gently touching Jasmine's shoulder. You're so brave, baby. So brave. Jasmine managed a small smile in return. When they reached their seats and the applause finally died down, the lights dimmed once more and the orchestra prepared for the second half of the program. But before the conductor could lift his baton, Edward Morrison stepped onto the stage one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, I want to make a formal announcement on behalf of Symphony Hall's Board of Directors. He unfolded a piece of paper, though Roland suspected he didn't need notes for what he was about to say. Effective immediately, Symphony Hall is implementing mandatory anti-racism and implicit bias training for all employees, volunteers, and board members. This training will be conducted quarterly, not as a one-time checkbox but as an ongoing commitment to growth and awareness. Applause rippled through the audience. Edward wasn't finished. Additionally, we are creating an inclusion task force that will review all our policies, practices, and procedures to identify and eliminate barriers to equitable access. This task force will include representatives from the communities we've historically underserved, ensuring that we're not making decisions about them without them. And finally, we are establishing a confidential reporting system for anyone who experiences or witnesses discrimination in our facilities. Reports will be investigated promptly, and there will be consequences for violations of our values. More applause, louder now. Edward looked directly at Roland. Mr. Bennett, you gave us $20 million to restore our building. Tonight, you've given us something far more valuable, a mirror to examine ourselves honestly, and a roadmap for becoming the institution we should always have been. Thank you. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that felt significant coming from a man of his position and generation. Roland stood and bowed in return, acknowledging the commitment. The conductor finally raised his baton, and the opening notes of Dvorak's New World Symphony filled the hall. The piece, written by a Czech composer inspired by African American spirituals and Native American music, felt impossibly appropriate. It was, as Edward had noted, a work about finding home in unfamiliar places, about creating something beautiful from the mixing of cultures. Jasmine sat between her parents, her hand alternating between gripping theirs, her eyes fixed on the orchestra. The music washed over all three of them, providing a kind of catharsis that words couldn't achieve. During a quiet passage in the second movement, a young black girl, perhaps 8 years old, appeared in the aisle beside their row. She was accompanied by her mother, who whispered something encouraging. The girl stepped closer to Jasmine and held out a piece of paper. Jasmine took it, opened it to find a crayon drawing of two girls holding hands under a rainbow, with the words, "You belong here," written in careful child's handwriting. Jasmine looked up at the girl, who smiled shyly, then returned to her seat. The simple gesture broke something open in Jasmine's chest, and she started crying, but these were different tears. These were healing tears. As the symphony built toward its triumphant finale, Roland found himself reflecting on the evening's journey. He had come here simply wanting to share his love of music with his daughter. Instead, he had been forced to confront, once again, the reality that his success, his wealth, his philanthropy didn't shield his family from racism. But he had also witnessed something powerful, the willingness of many people to stand with him, to acknowledge harm, to commit to being better. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough until the system itself changed, but it was something. The final notes of the symphony rang out, triumphant and soaring, and the audience erupted in applause that lasted 5 full minutes. People stood, cheered, some whistled. The conductor bowed repeatedly, gesturing to different sections of the orchestra, sharing the acclaim. When the applause finally began to fade, he turned to the audience and spoke into his microphone. Tonight has been extraordinary in ways none of us anticipated. This orchestra has played in this hall for over a century, but I don't think we've ever performed with more purpose or more awareness of music's power to unite humanity. Thank you to Mr. Bennett and his family for reminding us why we do this. As the formal program concluded and people began gathering their belongings, many audience members approached the Bennett family. Some wanted to thank Roland for his generosity and courage. Others wanted to apologize for remaining silent earlier. A white man in his 70s, wearing an expensive suit and medals that suggested military service, waited patiently for his turn to speak. When he reached Roland, he extended his hand. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Richard Hamilton. I was sitting in row 3 during the confrontation. I saw everything. And I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, that you could handle it yourself, that I didn't want to make a scene." His voice was thick with regret. Roland shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Hamilton." Richard shook his head. "It's not enough to be honest about my failure. I need to do better. We all do. I spent my career in the military learning about honor and courage, and tonight I failed to demonstrate either. That changes now. I give you my word." Roland looked into the older man's eyes and saw genuine remorse and determination. "Then the next time you witness injustice, speak up. That's all any of us can do, be better tomorrow than we were today." This interaction repeated itself over and over as they made their way toward the exit. Person after person approached, some to offer support, others to confess their own failures and pledge to act differently. A young white woman in her 20s, tears streaming down her face, told Jasmine, "I want to be braver because of you. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." An older black couple simply hugged Roland and Simone without words, the embrace conveying shared experience and solidarity that transcended language. When they finally reached the lobby, they found a news crew waiting with cameras and microphones. A reporter, a young black woman with natural hair and sharp eyes, approached respectfully. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Aaliyah Johnson from Channel 7 News. Would you be willing to answer a few questions about tonight?" Roland was about to decline when Jasmine tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, can I talk to them?" Roland looked down at his daughter in surprise. "Are you sure, baby? You don't have to." Jasmine nodded. "I want to. I have things to say." Roland looked at the reporter. "Interview my daughter. Her voice matters more than mine." Aaliyah's eyes lit up, recognizing the significance of this choice. She knelt down to Jasmine's level, microphone positioned but not thrust in the child's face. "Jasmine, can you tell me about tonight? What do you want people to know?" The camera focused on Jasmine's face, capturing her mixture of exhaustion and determination. Jasmine took a breath, gathering her thoughts with impressive composure for someone so young. "Tonight taught me that standing up for yourself is scary but necessary. It taught me that dignity isn't something people give you, it's something you claim for yourself. And it taught me that my daddy is the bravest person I know, because he could have stayed quiet to make things easier, but he spoke up to make things better." She paused, then added, "I hope other kids who look like me watch this and know that they belong everywhere. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You're just as important as everyone else." The reporter blinked back tears, clearly moved. "That's beautiful, Jasmine. Thank you. Is there anything you want to say to the woman who confronted your family?" Jasmine thought for a moment. "I hope she learns and changes. I hope she never makes another kid feel like she made me feel. And I hope she knows that forgiveness is possible if she does the work." The wisdom of that statement, coming from a 12-year-old who had every right to hold a grudge, was stunning. Aaliyah thanked them and signaled to her cameraman that they had what they needed. As the Bennett family finally walked toward their car, Roland's phone began buzzing incessantly with messages, emails, and notifications. The story was already spreading on social media, people who had been in the audience posting their own accounts, praising Roland's handling of the situation and Jasmine's remarkable poise. By morning, he knew, this would be national news. But for now, in this moment, all that mattered was getting his daughter home, making sure she was okay, and beginning the process of healing from wounds that shouldn't have been inflicted in the first place. 3 months passed like water flowing over stones, each day smoothing the rough edges of that painful night while leaving permanent marks that changed everyone involved. The morning after the concert, Roland's phone had exploded with interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages of support from around the world. The video of Jasmine's interview went viral, viewed over 20 million times, with countless people commenting on her maturity, wisdom, and grace. But Roland had been selective about media engagement, choosing to protect his daughter's privacy while strategically amplifying the message about systemic change. Preston Whitmore arrived at Bennett Technologies headquarters on Tuesday morning at 8:30, half an hour early for his 9 o'clock appointment. He wore a modest suit, carried a notebook, and looked like a man who had spent 3 sleepless nights examining his life. The diversity, equity, and inclusion team met him with professional courtesy but no particular warmth. They had been briefed on what happened at Symphony Hall, and their job was to assess whether this man was capable of genuine change or simply good at performing contrition. The day was grueling. Preston participated in workshops about implicit bias, listened to personal testimonies from employees of color about their experiences with discrimination in corporate settings, engaged in role-playing exercises that forced him to confront his own assumptions, and wrote reflection papers about what he was learning. By 4 in the afternoon, he was emotionally exhausted but visibly transformed. The DEI team lead, a black woman named Dr. Patricia Morgan, sat across from him in a conference room for the final evaluation. "Preston, I'm going to be direct with you," Dr. Morgan said, her tone professional but not unkind. "What you did, or rather failed to do, at that concert revealed a lack of moral courage. However, what I've observed today suggests genuine capacity for growth. You haven't made excuses. You haven't centered your own discomfort. You've listened, really listened, to perspectives that challenge your worldview. That's rarer than you might think." Preston nodded, accepting the assessment without argument. Dr. Morgan continued, "Mr. Bennett has asked me to make a recommendation about whether to proceed with a formal interview. My recommendation is yes, with conditions." The conditions were extensive. 6 months of ongoing DEI training. Regular check-ins with Dr. Morgan's team. Active participation in the company's anti-racism initiatives. And a commitment to use his position, if hired, to advocate for equitable practices in every business partnership he developed. Preston agreed to all of it immediately. "Dr. Morgan, I'm grateful for this opportunity. I won't let you down, and more importantly, I won't let myself down by reverting to who I was. Thank you." They shook hands, and Preston left the building walking differently than he had entered, his shoulders back, his purpose clear. Constance Whitmore's journey was harder and slower. The therapist she had consulted diagnosed her with deep-seated prejudices rooted in childhood socialization and class anxiety. The work of unpacking those beliefs was painful, forcing her to confront not just her actions at Symphony Hall but decades of smaller cruelties and exclusions she had perpetrated or condoned. She attended weekly sessions, joined an anti-racism reading group, and began volunteering at a youth orchestra program in an underserved neighborhood. The children there, predominantly black and brown, initially eyed her with suspicion. But she showed up consistently, helped organize fundraisers, assisted with instrument repairs, and slowly, painfully, began to earn a measure of trust. One afternoon, 2 months after the concert, Constance was helping a young black girl, maybe 9 years old, tune her violin when the girl looked up at her and asked, "Miss Connie, why do you come here? You don't got to." Constance paused, considering how to answer honestly without burdening this child with adult complexities. "Because I did something very wrong, and I'm trying to become a better person. You and the other children here are teaching me how to be kind and see people for who they really are, not what I assumed about them. Does that make sense?" The girl thought about this, then nodded. "My grandma says people can change if they really want to. Do you really want to?" Constance felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. I really want to." Symphony Hall underwent its own transformation. The mandatory training Edward Morrison promised was implemented with surprising rigor. The Inclusion Task Force conducted a comprehensive audit of policies and practices, identifying dozens of subtle barriers to equitable access. Ticket pricing was restructured to include more affordable options. A free concert series was launched in community centers across the city. Partnerships were established with schools in underserved neighborhoods, providing free transportation to performances and backstage tours. The changes were substantive, not cosmetic, and within 3 months, the demographic composition of audiences began to shift noticeably. Edward Morrison personally reached out to Roland to report on progress and seek advice. They developed an unlikely friendship, the older white arts administrator and the younger black tech entrepreneur finding common ground in their shared commitment to justice. Edward invited Roland to join the Symphony Hall board, and Roland accepted on condition that the board itself diversify significantly. Within 6 months, 5 new board members were added, all people of color with deep ties to communities that had historically been excluded from classical music spaces. The Bennett Foundation's Dignity in Arts initiative became a model for corporate philanthropy nationwide. 40 arts organizations applied for funding in the first round. 10 were selected based on demonstrated commitment to change and willingness to be held accountable for measurable results. Site visits, surveys, and focus groups tracked progress. 2 organizations that failed to meet their commitments had funding withdrawn. The message was clear: this was not performative grant-making, this was investment in genuine transformation with real consequences for failure. The Young Musicians of Promise Scholarship Program received over 1,000 applications. 50 students were selected for full scholarships, including instruments, private lessons, summer intensive programs, and college counseling. Jasmine Bennett volunteered to mentor several of the younger recipients, video chatting with them weekly to offer encouragement and advice. Watching his daughter pay forward the privileges she had received brought Roland more joy than any business success ever had. For months after the concert, Jasmine was invited to perform a solo at Symphony Hall's season-opening gala. Roland and Simone sat in the front row, same seats they had occupied that transformative night, watching their daughter walk onto the stage in a beautiful purple dress, carrying her violin with confidence. She had chosen to play a piece by Jessie Montgomery, a black woman composer whose work celebrated African American musical traditions. The performance was technically flawless and emotionally transcendent. When Jasmine finished, lowering her bow and looking out at the audience with a smile that radiated pure joy, the ovation lasted 3 full minutes. In the audience sat Preston Whitmore, who had been formally hired by Bennett Technologies 6 weeks earlier and was thriving in his role. He stood and applauded with tears streaming down his face, thinking about how close he had come to losing this opportunity, this trajectory, this possibility of being part of something meaningful. Beside him sat his mother, who had purchased a ticket and attended specifically to witness Jasmine's triumph. When their eyes met across the rows, Constance mouthed, "Thank you," and Jasmine, with the generous heart of someone who had been raised to believe in redemption, smiled and nodded in return. After the performance, Roland stood to address the audience once more. "For months ago, I stood on this stage and spoke about pain, about injustice, about the need for change. Tonight, I'm standing here filled with hope. Not naive hope that ignores ongoing struggles, but earned hope based on witnessing real transformation." He gestured around the auditorium. "Look around you. This audience is more diverse than it was 4 months ago. The staff and volunteers of this institution have done deep work to examine their biases and practices. Arts organizations across the country are implementing similar changes, creating spaces where all children can experience beauty without fear of being told they don't belong." He looked at Jasmine, who stood beside him still holding her violin. "My daughter's talent would have existed whether or not she ever stepped foot in this building. But having spaces where that talent can be celebrated, where she can see herself reflected in the artists and audiences around her, where she can simply be a kid who loves music without constantly fighting for her right to be here, that's what we're fighting for. That's what the Dignity in Arts initiative is about. That's what all of this work is about." Roland's voice grew stronger. "Change is possible. Real, substantive, lasting change. But it requires 3 things. First, it requires people who have been harmed to speak up, to refuse to accept injustice quietly, even when it would be easier to stay silent. Second, it requires people who have caused harm or benefited from unjust systems to listen, to examine themselves honestly, and to commit to being different going forward. And third, it requires all of us to hold each other accountable, to not accept performative gestures as substitutes for genuine transformation. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the hundreds of faces looking back at him. So to everyone watching tonight's live stream and everyone here in person, I ask you this: what will you do? When you witness injustice, will you speak up or look away? When you're confronted with your own biases, will you defend them or examine them? When institutions you support fail to live up to their stated values, will you hold them accountable or give them a pass? The answers to these questions determine what kind of world my daughter inherits, what kind of world all our children inherit. The speech concluded to another standing ovation. But Roland wasn't finished with his evening. He had one more planned moment, one more gesture to cement the transformation he had witnessed. He gestured to the wings, and Preston and Constance Whitmore walked onto the stage, both looking nervous but determined. The audience murmured in recognition. Many people there had been present at the original concert and remembered what happened. Roland put his hand on Preston's shoulder. 4 months ago, this young man was complicit in his mother's attempt to exclude my family from this space. He didn't initiate the harm, but he didn't stop it either. Tonight, I want to publicly acknowledge his growth. Preston has completed extensive anti-racism training. He's actively working to dismantle oppressive systems in his role at my company. He's become an advocate rather than a bystander. This is what redemption looks like. It's not about being perfect, it's about being committed to continuous improvement. He turned to Constance. And this woman, who said such painful things to my family, has spent 4 months in therapy, in education, in service to communities she previously excluded. She's volunteered over 200 hours at a youth orchestra program, using her privilege and resources to open doors for children who look like my daughter. She still has work to do, we all do, but she's doing it. That matters. Constance was crying openly now, overwhelmed by this public grace she never expected to receive. Roland looked out at the audience one last time. I'm showing you these two people not because their journey is complete, but because their journey is possible. If they can change, anyone can. If we can create space for people to grow past their prejudices, we can create the world we want to see. But that space must include accountability. Growth requires discomfort. Change requires work. And justice requires all of us to commit to it every single day. What happened next was unexpected and entirely organic. People in the audience began standing not to applaud but to speak. One by one, individuals shared their own stories of bias, of harm they had caused or received, of commitments they were making to be better. An elderly white woman admitted to crossing the street when young black men approached on the sidewalk and pledged to examine that fear. A middle-aged Asian man confessed to making assumptions about Latino colleagues' documentation status and committed to challenging that bias in himself and others. A young black woman thanked Roland for making her feel seen in classical music spaces where she had always felt like an outsider. The testimonies continued for 20 minutes, turning the concert hall into a kind of collective confessional and commitment ceremony. Edward Morrison wept openly, recognizing that his theater had become something more than a performance venue. It had become a community space where healing and transformation could occur. When the testimonies finally ended, Roland proposed one final gesture. Let's commit together. If you're willing to do the ongoing work of anti-racism, of creating more equitable spaces, of speaking up when you witness injustice, stand with us now. The entire auditorium rose as one. Over 1,000 people standing in solidarity, committing themselves to the work ahead. Jasmine looked out at all those faces and felt something shift inside her. The pain of that first night would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the only part. She had witnessed the power of speaking truth, the possibility of redemption, and the strength of community committed to justice. She had become part of a movement larger than herself, and that felt more powerful than any solo performance ever could. As the audience began to disperse, people forming small groups to continue conversations, exchanging contact information to maintain accountability partnerships, making plans to volunteer together. Roland pulled his family close. "How are you doing, baby girl?" Jasmine looked up at her father with eyes that seemed older now, marked by experience but not hardened by it. "I'm good, Daddy. I'm really good. I'm glad we didn't leave that night. I'm glad you stood up for us. And I'm glad we gave them a chance to be better." Roland kissed the top of her head, marveling at her wisdom. Simone wrapped her arms around both of them. "I'm proud of you both. Of all three of us. We turned our pain into purpose. That's not nothing." They stood there for a moment, a family that had been tested and emerged stronger, a family that had chosen grace without abandoning justice, a family that had reminded everyone watching that dignity is not negotiable and that change, real change, is possible when people have the courage to demand it and the grace to believe others can rise to meet that demand. The final image of that evening was captured by countless phone cameras and would circulate on social media for months afterward. Roland, Simone, and Jasmine standing at center stage, arms around each other, while behind them the entire orchestra rose to their feet in respect. On either side stood Preston and Constance Whitmore, no longer antagonists but participants in a larger story about redemption and transformation. And filling the auditorium were 1,000 people of all races and backgrounds, standing together, committed to building a world where nights like the first one would no longer be possible because everyone, truly everyone, would know they belong. So here's what I want to know from you watching this. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and stayed silent? Have you ever been the person discriminated against? Or maybe you've realized you hold biases you need to examine. Drop a comment sharing your experience and what you're committing to do differently. Hit that like button if this story moved you to action, not just emotion. Subscribe to this channel because stories like this remind us why the fight for dignity and justice matters. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that change is possible, that redemption is real, but that both require continuous, uncomfortable, courageous work. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for committing to be part of building a world where every child, regardless of their skin color, knows without question that they belong everywhere beauty and humanity are celebrated. May we all have the courage of the Bennetts and the humility to grow like the Whitmores. Until next time, keep standing up, keep speaking out, and keep believing in the power of transformation. This story reveals profound truths about dignity, prejudice, and transformation. First, respect should never be conditional on someone's wealth or status. The Bennett family deserved courtesy whether Roland was a billionaire or a bus driver. Second, silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit. Those who witnessed Constance's behavior and said nothing enabled her actions. Third, speaking up requires courage but creates ripples of change far beyond the immediate moment. Roland's decision to address discrimination publicly rather than quietly leaving sparked institutional transformation that will benefit countless families. Fourth, redemption is possible but demands genuine work, not performative apologies. Preston and Constance's ongoing commitment to education and service demonstrated real change versus empty words. Fifth, children absorb lessons from how adults handle adversity. Jasmine learned that dignity isn't given but claimed, that grace and justice can coexist, and that her voice matters. Sixth, systemic change requires accountability structures, not just good intentions. The Bennett Foundation's approach of tying funding to measurable outcomes ensured organizations followed through on commitments. Finally, transformation happens when those harmed find courage to speak, those causing harm find humility to listen, and communities create spaces for difficult conversations. This story reminds us that the fight against racism isn't won through single confrontations but through sustained commitment to examining biases, challenging assumptions, and building truly inclusive spaces where every person knows they belong. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced discrimination like the Bennett family, or witnessed it happening to someone else? What did you do, and what would you do differently now? Drop your story in the comments below. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their race or background, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell because we share stories that challenge us to be better, to stand up for justice, and to create change in our communities. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that speaking up matters, that transformation is possible, and that silence is never neutral. Your share could be the catalyst that inspires someone else to find their courage. Thank you for watching, for engaging with this important story, and for committing to be part of the solution. May you have the courage to speak truth like Roland, the grace to forgive like Jasmine, and the humility to grow like Preston. Remember, change starts with each of us choosing to do better today than we did yesterday. Until next time, keep standing for what's right, keep your heart open to transformation, and keep believing that together, we can build a world where everyone truly belongs.